All right, everybody, let's get started. Thanks for joining us on this Thursday evening. My name is Jordan Long, and I'm a speaker's chair with Texas FedSoc chapter here at UT Law. I want to thank the Awesome Lawyers chapter for co-hosting this event with us tonight. For those of you who are listening who are not FedSoc members but are interested in joining, please contact Henry Humphreys, and his information is in the chat box. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker. Tim Carney is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he works on economic competition, cronyism, civil society, localism, and religion in America. He is concurrently the commentary editor with the Washington Examiner. Mr. Carney's latest book, Alienated America, Why Some Places Thrive While Others Collapse, was published in 2019. In addition to his Washington Examiner columns, Mr. Carney's work has been published in a variety of magazines, websites, and newspapers, including The Atlantic, The New York Post, The New York Times, Reason Magazine, and The Wall Street Journal. His television appearances include CNBC, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and PBS NewsHour. We're really looking forward to this event tonight, Mr. Carney, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So I've written a few books, and two of them were on a topic you might call crony capitalism. That's what I'm going to talk with you guys about. I didn't always use that term. It was actually Sarah Palin, of all people, who made that really popular in this country. I often spoke of something called corporatism or corporate welfare. Cronyism works too. But today we're going to have a little sort of extra focus on the administrative state, which is to say, a lot of people think the federal government works the way the Constitution describes. Congress makes laws, the executive branch, which is to say the president and his appointees, execute the laws, the judicial branch interprets the laws. Increasingly in this country, though, the executive branch, and often not even appointees, but career hires, end up being the ones who make the law. And as we also know, the courts make the law, but that's a topic all you future lawyers and your more lawyery friends can talk about. I'm going to talk about the administrative state, also some about Congress and state legislators. And the basic lesson is this: when you give more power to the government, you are creating a system where the guys who can hire the best lobbyists will win. And specifically, when you embed power to give out lots of money and to make laws in the administrative state, in federal and state agencies that are beyond the reach of democracy, then the people who will fare the best are going to be the guys who can afford to hire up the former bureaucrats, who know how to lobby, who know the game, who can play the game, who know the system. In other words, an increase in government, particularly an increase in the administrative state, is a home game for the biggest businesses with the best lobbyists. So it's an election season. One good place to start would be Donald Trump's speech accepting the Republican nomination back in 2016. He was criticizing Hillary Clinton, and he said, "When the Secretary of State rakes in millions of dollars trading access and favors to special interests and foreign powers, I know the time for action has come. I have joined the political arena so that the powerful can no longer beat up on people that cannot defend themselves. Nobody knows the system better than me," Trump said, and then he kind of mugged for the audience, which applauded, "which is why I alone can fix it. I have seen firsthand how the system is rigged against our citizens." So he was basically saying, look, I was a crony developer in the corrupt New York City commercial real estate thing, so I know how to play this game, and I can fix it. And then he wins the election, surprising me and most people, and immediately works with his running mate, future Vice President Mike Pence, to arrange millions of dollars in subsidies to the company Carrier and its parent company, United Technology, in order to fulfill a campaign promise of keeping some jobs here in America. So Pence was still the governor of Indiana, and the state legislature there had given the governor the power to just hand out money at his own discretion. So the spending power, which is traditionally vested in a legislature, in most states, they give governors the ability to basically bribe companies to stay. And so in this case, Pence used it to pay Carrier with massive tax credits so that they'll keep some jobs in Indiana instead of moving them down to Mexico. That also wasn't the only consideration Carrier used when they decided to keep some of those jobs in Indiana. The CEO said, quote, "I was born at night, but not last night. I know that about 10% of our revenue comes from the US government," which is to say, because the Defense Department and other government federal agencies get to make or break Carrier through their spending, the CEO felt he had to do what President-elect Trump was asking him to do and keep some of the jobs here. Now, and then United Technologies got $2.5 billion in a single Pentagon contract for airplane parts, and the DoD handed out that contract without even any competition. Now, they had an argument for that, and that is, often allowed, but you see here how there was no part where the legislative branch was involved. The executive branch and the state level was spending the money, and then Defense Department is deciding who gets the money. And United Technologies, being in favor with and connected with these executive branches on two different levels, seem to be padding its bottom line there. Now, it's not always just about cash. Usually it's more complicated than that, the way that the big guys use big government and the administrative state to their benefit. Trump, for example, in early August said he would ban TikTok or its parent company because it poses a security threat unless TikTok sold to a US company. So then later Trump says, quote, "I think Oracle is a great company, and I think its owner is a tremendous guy. He's a tremendous person. I think Oracle would certainly be somebody that could handle it." Now, then Oracle moves in and becomes the leading potential purchaser, kind of, it's complicated, of TikTok's parent company. Now, it just happens to be back on February 19th at his estate in Coachella Valley. Ellison, the CEO of Oracle, happened to host a fundraiser for Donald Trump. Rahm Emanuel, some of you guys might remember the name. He was a Clinton White House official, then a member of Congress, then Barack Obama's chief of staff, then the mayor of Chicago. So after he leaves the Clinton administration, he landed a job, not as a lobbyist, but as an investment banker for a firm called Wasserstein Perella. He had no experience in banking, no MBA. He took a high perch as a managing director there and then made lots and lots of money. One of his two biggest deals would not have happened except for government pressure. So there was a telecom company called SBC. It bought another telecom company called Ameritech. SBC wanted to hold on to the home security company that Ameritech had, which was called SecurityLink. Then Bill Clinton's Federal Communications Commission comes in and says, "No, SBC, if you want to buy Ameritech, you have to sell the security company." Emanuel happened to be working on behalf of a venture capital fund that wanted to buy SecurityLink from these companies. So the government comes in, pressures Ameritech to sell SecurityLink, and this venture capital fund, which was Rahm Emanuel's client, gets a good deal because they were forced to sell. The way Chicago Tribune put it was, under regulatory deadline to divest itself of SecurityLink, SBC financed all but $100 million of the $479 million purchase price of the firm. Less than 6 months later, Emanuel's client sells the company for $1 billion, earning a quick $500 million on its investment. So this is crony capitalism. It's nothing new. People in power and close to power are using that power to enrich themselves. Trump's crony capitalism, I would say, is more like a kind of small town or third world cronyism. The more standard version is something bigger. I usually call it corporatism. It's the realization that big business and big government are partners and that they benefit one another. And this applies specifically to the increase of power in the executive branch and taking it away from Congress. In Congress, what you get is all sorts of lobbying and campaign contributions, which can be corrupting, but I think the corrupting nature of that is overstated. This is why I like the term corporatism. Cronyism, the examples I just talked about, some of the future examples will show somebody rewarding an insider and pocketing the money. The bigger example of what's often called cronyism is this corporatism, where both sides just realize, in general, bigger is better for all of us. Bigger business, bigger government, bigger administrative state. So one story from, a couple stories from the Obama administration, since I already picked on Trump a couple times here. Taxes. So if any of you guys have had to do taxes, maybe you use TurboTax, maybe you use H&R Block. A lot of people know a guy who does their taxes. That is next door neighbor, somebody like that. I know people who are stay-at-home moms, but during tax season, they work and they prepare people's taxes. There are lots of people who are retired, don't work 9 months out of the year, 3 months out of the year, they get paid to help people prepare their taxes. Now, if they do something fraudulent or negligent, those people are subject to, if they do something negligent, they're subject to heavy fines, these part-time tax preparers. If they do something fraudulent, they can go to jail, just like anybody else, just like the guy at H&R Block or the CEO if he set up the whole thing that way. But part of the problem is that they were cutting into the business of H&R Block, Jackson Hewitt, TurboTax. So then the CEO of H&R Block happened to leave H&R Block right about the time Obama was coming into office. And Obama happened to appoint the CEO of H&R Block to be a top executive in the Treasury Department. Now, this would have violated Obama's own revolving door rules, except they decided to not count it as an appointment, but as a career hire. Now, there's lots of rules about who's a career hire in the federal government and who's an appointee, but this position sort of lent itself to a career federal position. Now, the CEO, Mark Ernst, this was his only job ever. He had never before worked in the federal government, and he would never again. So his career was a handful of months. What he did in that career was he crafted new rules. Now, this is going to sound like something Congress would do. He made new rules about who was allowed to prepare taxes. So specifically, he required anyone who is paid to prepare taxes to get a license, pass a test, pay an annual fee, and complete a 15-hour course in tax training every year. Now, that course happens to line up with what these major tax preparers were already doing for their employees, because the turnover in H&R Block, as you might imagine, is pretty rapid. They're basically hiring seasonal workers at H&R Block. So every year they have to retrain these people. And getting the license and paying an annual fee, well, that's water off the back of a company like Jackson Hewitt, H&R Block, et cetera. And so, and many paid preparers already, meet these standards. There's something called an enrolled agent where you already have to do this. But the idea that somebody could just spend 3 months part-time doing this was allowed. Again, there's a risk if you go with the guy down the street. Maybe he messes up and then you get in trouble. But maybe he's your next door neighbor whom you've known for 20 years and you trust him. Maybe you've been using him for 10 years. Maybe your dad used him for 30 years before that. There are reasons to go with the big firms, reasons to go with the small firms, and risks with both. But what Mark Ernst, the former CEO of H&R Block, did is he wrote rules effectively outlawing part-time tax preparers. How does a guy like that, in a position like that, effectively legislate, create a new law? Well, the IRS would argue in court that because the IRS has the right to regulate people who appear before, decide who gets to appear before tax court, that they therefore had the right to decide who gets to prepare taxes. The argument made no sense. They actually got literally laughed out of court. I actually been friends with the guy whose job it was to defend the IRS, and the judge effectively told him, look, I trust you, I respect you. The argument you're making here is absurd, and I'm sorry that you have to make it because it's the worst argument I've ever heard before me, is what the judge effectively told the lawyer who was making the argument. Before he lost in court, though, before the IRS lost in court, the lobbyists for H&R Block were going around and telling everybody, this is going to be really good for H&R Block. This is going to kill our smaller competitors. And in fact, I found out about this from a research note put out by a bank saying, hey, everybody, you should invest in H&R Block because this new rule is going to kill all their small competitors and drive lots of business their way. So that's a way in which the biggest company having an in to the administrative state in a way no small preparer, no small competitor ever would, is able to use big government to crowd out competition and increase its profits. And big government likes this, even aside from the CEO's job in there, because from the perspective of a regulator, you want there to be fewer regulating bodies. You want, if you had your way, there'd be one monopoly in tax preparation because it's easier for you to deal with them. So I actually used to work in, I volunteered on a neighborhood commission called the Alcohol Beverage Licensing Commission. This was in a neighborhood in DC that was really down and out, but it was on its way up. And so I considered it, my job is to clear any regulatory hurdles to bars that want to open up. So what I found though, the first bar was the H Street Martini Lounge. The next three bars were all by a guy. He just passed away actually. His name was Joe Engler. And one of the guys on my commission, he's an official Green Party member, he turned to me and another Green Party guy after one of these hearings, said, it just bugs me that 3 out of 4 of these are going to be owned by one guy. It's almost like a monopoly. And then the other guy at the end of the commission said, well, the upside of it is if there's only one guy we have to talk to, then it's easier for us to get him to do what we want him to do. This is how the state, the administrative state sees. They prefer monopoly to competition. They see competition as redundancy. They see competition. You ask a big bank, how are you going to make sure that your loans are safe? Well, the big banks will have certain rules and they might just say, you can write the rules for us. A small community bank will say, well, we know these people. We know who's safe. We know that a fourth Chinese restaurant isn't going to work, but a first massage parlor is. We know, so that is to say, the regulatory process on big guys is more clean cut, more able to see from 30,000 feet. The regulatory process for many, many small competitors is messier for somebody who wants order. I'm going to tell a couple more stories. Mostly I want to hear questions, comments, all that sort of stuff for you. But another one has to do with tobacco. Again, the theme here is that big business benefits from big government. This is the opposite of the story you're mostly told in the media. When Barack Obama signed a bill creating federal regulation of tobacco in 2009, Ted Kennedy said, Washington has finally said no to big tobacco. Tom Harkin, a Democratic senator from Iowa, said, this bill is about standing up to the power of big tobacco. Meanwhile, Philip Morris, which controlled a majority of the US cigarette market, put out a press release saying, Philip Morris supports this bill. The law hadn't been implemented yet, but they knew, journalists at the time called it the Marlboro Monopoly Act. They knew that more regulation was going to crush their smaller competitors and freeze their market share in place. And very importantly, they knew that more regulation was going to create a home game for them, which is to say, a law passes and then it gets implemented by the federal agencies, giving the FDA power over the tobacco industry was making things a lot more controllable by Philip Morris than leaving things up to markets and or lawsuits and or anything else like that. So when Altria, again, the parent company, they hired Colleen Klassmeyer to work on all these issues. Colleen Klassmeyer used to be a counsel at the Food and Drug Administration. So when they're filing their paperwork saying, here's how the regulation should be deployed, it's written by the sort of person, by the very person who wrote these very same sort of regulations just a couple years ago, and who had already given the maximum contribution to Barack Obama's campaign. And so their letters reinforce Philip Morris actively supported the passage of the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. By the way, I love that name of the bill, Family Smoking Prevention. When I first read that, I thought, what is family smoking? I mean, I'm not a smoker, but that kind of sounded nice to me. I imagine me with my cigar, my wife with her cigarettes, and my kids all with little pipes or something. Anyway, Family Smoking Prevention Tobacco Control Act. And they went ahead and in their filings, they said, hey, we should tweak this little detail or tweak that little detail. You looked at the filings by smaller companies. I looked at one by a company called Smokin' Joe's. An Indian tribe owned this cigarette company. And the way they did their marketing was they would go up to a convenience store or a gas station and say to the guy behind the counter, say to the manager, hey, these are natural, these are local, I don't know, maybe they were organic, and you say, try these cigarettes. You will like them, you'll sell them to your customers, they'll love them. In other words, they use free samples to business owners to get their local marketing. Well, free samples were outlawed. You could imagine a reason why. You don't want tobacco, you don't want Philip Morris mailing packets to kids to get them addicted, right? But this one-size-fits-all regulation that prevents the cigarette company from giving a cigarette to a manager of a store, well, Smokin' Joe's, who had to hire a lawyer to write this letter, they didn't have one on staff, said if we can't give to business owners, we don't have they said most of our retail members are small. The National Association of Tobacco Outlets said most of our retail members are small business owners who do not have the wherewithal to hire counsel to interpret letters. Smokin' Joe said, we can't work with the distributors who are basically beholden to the big guys. So more regulation, crush the smaller guys, does nothing bad to Philip Morris, actually helps Philip Morris build up its market share. As you see, when you shift the power over to the administrative state, you make it a home game for the big guys. Last story about toys. In 2007 or 2008, there was like an outbreak of a few kids got lead poisoning because they were chewing on their toys. Now, lead paint on toys, bad. No kids died, still. Don't put lead paint on kids' toys. The toys were sold by the big companies, Mattel and Hasbro, and they were made in big factories in China. So somehow this story in the end ends up benefiting Mattel and Hasbro. How? Well, because of Congress's overreaction and the nature of the administrative state. So what happened is, after these toys happened, Obama, who was a presidential candidate, said, I will ban all toys made in China. That wasn't going to happen. Instead, they passed the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act. Under this, every manufacturer of a children's product, whether it's a toy truck, a pacifier, a book for kids, a kid-sized little stool that you sit on, they have to submit their products for independent tests for lead and other chemicals before selling them. So if Mattel rolls off 400,000 little Dora the Explorer rubber toys, they have to submit one of those. If your grandfather produces a little mannequin toy or hammers together a chair for kids to sit in and tries to sell it or even give it away in any public forum, he would have to submit that one item for testing. The testing costs about $1,000. So you could imagine what this does is basically say there can be no artisanal toys, there can be no artisanal children's furniture. And if you thought about like making a kid's book and producing 100 copies for the children, a local soup kitchen, forget about it. That would be totally illegal. In fact, thrift stores were terrified that if they resold toys, that they would be punished for it. So Mattel and Hasbro lobbied for this bill. They hired up the former chief of staff of one of the senators, Amy Klobuchar, who ended up sponsoring the bill. And they passed it. But what they stuck into the bill was a provision that you don't have to send it out for outside testing if you can create your own internal testing process, which passes the inspection of the Consumer Product Safety Commission? Well, exactly one company was able to afford the ability to create this internal testing process and then get the Consumer Product Safety Commission to come and study it and give them passing grades. And that happened to be Mattel, the largest toy maker, the ones who had made the leaded toys in the first place, the ones who had lobbied for the bill, the ones who spent the most on lobbying at the time. So again, I could give many, many examples like this, but you see what happens. What we need regulation in this country, and we need big business and small business in this country, and we need to have an executive branch, and there needs to be some level of an administrative state in this country. But right now, we err, in my opinion, on the side of too big a federal control of the economy, too big of an administrative state, and all of this tips the balance too much to the big businesses and too much against the smaller businesses. Thankfully, there were reform efforts on that toy issue, and it's been largely deregulated for the smaller guys because Congress jumped in and threatened to jump in. Thankfully, the smaller tax preparers won in court. And on tobacco, I mean, it's a disappearing industry anyway, thankfully, which is good for the health of the country. But so that's going to fade away as an issue. But every day you're going to see, if you follow regulations closely, you're going to see the bigger guys have the ability to work the system on the inside, and that will concentrate power. Now, so I just was talking about it from a perspective of a guy who likes small business, is critical of big government, but I want to make a sort of bigger, a bigger kind of moral point. Crony capitalism, cronyism, corporatism needs to be something you care about if you care about fairness. So first of all, if some of you out there are like free market guys, this is the #1 threat to free enterprise, is crony capitalism. People, you think we've had a populist uprising now? It's going to get worse if crony capitalism continues to get worse. People will say, as Trump said, as Elizabeth Warren says, the game is rigged, and they will blame capitalism. Because the pursuit of profit is not actually a good thing in and of itself. The pursuit of profit is a good thing in the context of a free and open market with fair rules. Because then the pursuit of profit enriches the people who are producing something that is in high demand. But when the pursuit of profit is engaged in the context of rigged rules, then the people who get rich are not the people who give everybody what they want at a lower price. It's the people who hire the insiders, who know how to work the game, who know the system better than anyone else. And once that happens, there's actually no moral defense for the pursuit of profit, because you don't have any right to go and get rich on your own. Your right to get rich is dependent on, or your right to chase profit, etc., is dependent on the premise that in a free, open society with fair rules, you only get profit, ideally, not obviously never always, but ideally by giving people what they want. And then on the final side, we just need to care about fairness. If you guys are thinking about being lawyers, I hope that it's not because attorney is a lucrative job, but because everybody needs defense. Everybody, you know, there needs to be our system of law. There needs to be fairness, etc. And this applies in the economy. It's just not true that we should say any way that you try to chase after money is good. And it's just not true that we should say, well, these regulations, while they tilt the playing field, they're absolutely needed. The more we make things unfair, the more it's morally damaging, it's politically damaging, and it really undermines not just the free market system, but the democratic system in this country. Anyway, I'm happy to take your guys' questions, arguments, that sort of thing. How are we doing this? Should I read from the screen, or do you want to pick them out for me?
Yeah, I'll throw you some questions that I've gotten. So one question is, so kind of on that point that you just talked about you know, the motivation for lawyers to get involved. You know, we hear a lot about judicial engagement nowadays, and how much success have lawyers had in you know, going after some of these regulations and getting them judicially rejected? Or is
the Institute for Justice are the people who are doing this, and they're having a lot of success. arguing that there are things like a fundamental right to make a living. So if a government goes ahead and says, you can't arrange flowers without a license, and to get a license, you need to pass this test and take this class. Oh, and to take the class, you have to pay the existing florists, and the people who are going to pass or fail you are the people who you would be competing against. Places like the Institute for Justice have had success there. Now, I'm not going to try to quote the exact legal arguments that they make there, but effectively it's that unfair anti-competitive rules are in fact unconstitutional. The Department of Commerce under Reagan, one of the greatest things they did is set up an agency that just worries about, are these regulations anti-competitive? And that's been a real big boon in this, to say, well, these regulations go beyond. I mean, I was just bad-mouthing regulations. I do not oppose, rules requiring minimum number of hours before a commercial pilot can fly, inspections on Boeing jets. All these things are important. They all create barriers to entry and reduce competition. But guess what? Sometimes that's worth it, such as, is your jet safe to fly? Is your pilot safe to fly, et cetera. But if they go beyond that level where they're worth it, that's where there's been some success by people like the Institute for Justice in suing and saying, actually here, this regulation is not aimed at anything but protecting incumbent businesses. Now that's a legal question there. That's a live question. Is it legitimate for governments to say, I want to protect incumbent businesses? For example, on food trucks, a lot of cities have said the food trucks could drive restaurants out of business. If our restaurants go out of business, our downtown suffers. So we are going to pass this regulation in order to protect the food trucks. Now, is that a cronyist or a corporatist argument? It's a tricky question, but these are the issues being hashed out. And so I'll say there's a lot of success, but a lot of these are real live legal issues that are interesting to look into. Institute for Justice people have been over that for over a decade.
Some of the question we have in the chat box is, what do you think about Adrian from Wales' argument that the administrative state is not bad in and of itself and can be used for good if directed towards the, quote, common good based on morality and virtue?
Have you guys seen Lord of the Rings? And Boromir is kind of arguing this ring can be used for good. That's what I think of when I think of a lot of these arguments. There's a place for an administrative state. There's a place for centralized power, but the hopes and dreams of a lot of people, whether it's Adrian Vermeule or Sarab Amari, who I know well and I'm very friendly with, etc., that these things that they see the other side has been using for decades, we can now use them for good. The reason I doubt them, there's many reasons I doubt them. One is, what makes you think we'd be able to do good with them? Like, especially if you're conservative, you're losing ground these days. If you're a limited government conservative, your party is moving away from that, the Republican Party with Trump. If you're a social conservative, you're a religious conservative like I am, we're increasingly in the minority in this country. What's going to make you think that we can get away with this? Are we suddenly going to implant a bunch of, Latin mass Catholic or free enterprise people in the administrative state? No, the burrowed in bureaucrats are going to believe in the power of the state. The state never likes any rivals. And so a lot of businesses, unless they're explicitly allied with government, and things like a church are going to be explicitly antithetical to the state. I just don't think it works. I think it works in the kingdom of heaven. You can have an administrative state that does good things. On this level, concentrating power, taking it too far away from democratic accountability is going to result in evil.
Kind of tying your work on cronyism into some of your more recent work on sort of the decimation of Main Street America, how does that kind of go together for you? Especially, I'm curious about sort of the demise of small banks and some of the Dodd-Frank regulations.
Yeah, I mean, there's ways it goes together and there are ways it conflicts. So my most recent book, Alienated America, was sort of me trying to figure out why so many people thought the American dream was dead. Donald Trump said the American dream is dead, and I think that was the main thing that drew people to him, that they said, yes, it is. And I was trying to figure out why it was, whether there was just an economic explanation, whether it's just cultural resentment, as the New York Times would put it, or whether there's a better explanation. And my explanation was that I came up with after going around the country and researching, writing, thinking, was that it was a collapse of local communities. And often the first domino to fall was the closure of the factory. So what I definitely would have argued, had you asked me in my first two books, was the federal government should not be protecting from competition a factory in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, because those people will land in jobs that might pay slightly less in a sector that will have increased demand by the fact that, you know, my shoes or my steel is cheaper by the offshoring of it. What I found in this book and in the research and in my reporting was that the story wasn't that simple, that any sudden transformation of the economy of a place is going to really upend it, and that people aren't just going to land on their feet in a slightly lower paying job, but that their town was going to fall apart. And what you were going to end up with was opioid epidemics and the real destruction of lives. So on one level, that created a tension for me. On the other hand, what you're pointing out, though, is that the centralization of the government, like the Dodd-Frank regulation and the bailout combined, the centralization of government power over the economy results in a centralization of industries. And so the closure of small banks means that everybody trying to get a bank loan now has to check the boxes at Bank of America and Wells Fargo and that sort of thing. Well, it used to be you could get the bank loan if the guy said, yeah, we definitely need a movie theater in this town. There's definitely demand for it. And I know what you've done in your past businesses, you get a loan. Now somebody's going to say, movie theaters, they have a bad track record, checking some box, running some algorithm in Charlotte, North Carolina, Bank of America headquarters. And then local newspapers collapse. That I'm not going to blame on government, but it's a similar sort of thing where there are certain institutions that are really, really important to a community. And I think a newspaper, multiple local banks are two great examples. And that these businesses collapsing really does harm community cohesion and the ability of towns, especially small towns, to stick up for themselves.
So some more chat box questions. The administration has made it a point to push that they have been deregulating at a record rate. Is this true? And if so, where is the deregulation focused?
There have been a ton of deregulations. It's interesting. There are two areas where Trump has really outsourced any work, things he kind of doesn't care about. But the conservative movement in Washington built up infrastructure and expertise in them. And that's judges and deregulation. And so there are people who have been forming, especially since after Bush left, forming a deregulation plan. I wrote an article about it in the Examiner like 3 years ago. And seeing what are the different tools, what are the different things that we can unwind. And it's across the board. The EPA is probably being the most aggressive, but also there are all these rules. Obama extended Bush's light bulb ban to apply to bulbs that it was never intended to apply to, decorative bulbs, three-way bulbs, etc. And Trump is rolling that back. There's a shower head rule. I don't know if you guys know about this. I think there's a 1990s law limited how powerful your shower could be in order to save water and heat. And the Obama administration changed it so that if you had two shower heads in the same shower, each one had to have half the allowed power. And so Trump is going back and undoing that and redefining shower head as shower head. I'd say the EPA is the most aggressive. They are actually doing a lot of deregulation. The problem with this back and forth, though, is that as easy as it is to deregulate, it's easier to re-regulate. And as easy as it is to regulate, it's slightly harder to deregulate. So a lot of this is just going to be a constant back and forth, which is, of course, is a headache for businesses, big and small. But if you really want to, you can search on the internet of how to make your shower have more power just by removing a little washer. I call it pulling the government out of your shower head.
Another question from the Q&A box. In the aftermath of Lucia versus SEC, President Trump has removed ALJs from the competitive service and placed them in the accepted service. Ultimately, do you think that this change will be good or bad for consumers, or will it make no difference?
I don't know anything about this. Next question. Sorry.
No worries. Another question. How has the rise in increased presidential authority aided the rise of cronyism, especially with things like tariff controls?
Oh yeah, so tariff controls is a great example of where Congress just decided to hand its power over to the executive. I mean, that's the whole story. The history of this is 50% on things like war powers, and in this case, tariffs, Congress handing the executive power and not doing any oversight. And then it's 50% the executive branch kind of taking power to itself and Congress not objecting. So Congress passed a law saying you can see a logic behind the tariff laws, that if all of a sudden we realize, our enemy is flooding us with goods that would put our, ability to get lithium something necessary for defense, that we need to slap a tariff on it. But Trump is now using this to slap a tariff on aluminum ingots from Canada. Not all aluminum ingots from Canada. He's using a national security thing to do that. Now, this is protecting U.S. ingot makers, and it's harming U.S. car makers. If any of you have a Ford F-150, the significant parts of that are made with aluminum. That becomes more expensive. Ford and all their customers suffer by this stuff that's protecting the people Trump cares about more, the aluminum makers. He has that power because Congress gave him that power. It's absolutely incredible. If the president gets to say, I raise your taxes, I cut your taxes without Congress acting, that allows for more of the corruption type cronyism, bribery, that sort of stuff, than lobbying Congress ever did, but also allows for more of the sort of big picture corporatism that I talked about, where a president just sort of decides, here's what the shape of the economy should be like. Let's go ahead and make it be that way.
Another question from the Q&A box. Can you think of a developed, relatively free nation that has successfully stemmed cronyism in a lasting way?
I think we're the best. I mean, I complain about ours, but when I was writing about cronyism and corporate welfare under the Obama administration, I remember thinking, this wouldn't even be interesting in Russia. This wouldn't even be interesting in a lot of other countries because it's accepted as the norm. And the fact that we can be offended by stories like the H&R Block story shows that we've sort of being the freest major economy has helped us develop a sense of fair play that in a lot of other countries they don't. I think Germany operates on an explicitly corporatist model, which is to say, and you would hear Obama administration, Trump administration people saying, in Germany, they all travel as a pack. You've got Angela Merkel and these CEOs, and they're working together as a team, and they have a national champion. If Siemens wants to do something, everybody says, we're going to help you do it. Well, in the US, if Elon Musk or General Electric wants to do something, we'd be, hey, that'd be cool. I'll buy it if it works. That idea of fair play, fair competition is a pretty American thing. Again, I would bet if you could measure this objectively, Germany would have less corruption than us, certainly less corruption than the Mediterranean countries and then any of the developing countries. But corporatism is baked into their model very explicitly in a way that, especially since World War II, the US has at least tried to move away from in our self-understanding, but it still definitely exists. And I think in the last 12 years under Obama and Trump we're now increasing our sort of acceptance of an existence of corporatism.
10 years ago, Congress got rid of earmarks, right? And that was seen as a big win for people who were opposed to sort of the cronies creep into Congress and the federal government. Do you think that looking back, that was a mistake?
I don't know that it was a mistake because, I mean, I think it's an incredibly complicated issue. It has, I think, reduced the growth in federal spending. I don't think, and I can't prove that, but I think it has. It has also helped make Congress more dysfunctional. It was the grease that caused things to pass. Now, maybe it's fine that Congress doesn't really pass spending bills anymore. The government shutdown was objectively a bad thing. Threats of government shutdowns as the only way to do business seem to me like a bad thing. Maybe they're not. That's the primary effect, that Congress doesn't actually pass appropriations bills anymore. They just pass these continuing resolutions, and that the only way that anything ever gets passed into law half the time is by being stuck onto one of these must-pass continuing resolutions to prevent a government shutdown. I think Congress should learn a new way to legislate that doesn't depend on earmarks and like the over-centralization of fundraising that existed before McCain-Feingold was struck down, et cetera, and before the internet. But as far as the corruption, sort of the cronyism score, you did definitely see members of Congress writing earmarks for companies and then pocketing their money, or better yet, rather than just pocketing their $2,500 campaign contribution, cashing out and becoming a lobbyist for them. So basically, they gave, Bill Delahunt of Massachusetts gave millions of dollars to some company, retires from Congress, becomes a lobbyist, and immediately brings him on as a client. So he gives them millions of dollars, they give him hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's the sort of corrupt deal that earmarks cost. But what Ron Paul would have argued was the Constitution gives the spending power to Congress. It doesn't give the spending power to the Department of Health and Human Services or Department of Housing and Urban Development, or really even the Department of Defense. Now, with a government this big, could Congress actually go? Would you want Congress deciding, or would you want the Pentagon deciding which sort of fighter jet to get? Well, sometimes Congress does decide, but sometimes it's as little as which wiring system in this particular weapons aspect. I don't want Congress doing that. This is a big, I don't know, this is a really tough question argument. I think it's a really interesting debate. I think the earmark ban, if you're going to consider its effects on federal spending and on corruption are secondary to its effects on the dysfunction in Congress. And that's a real place to look.
Well, Mr. Carney, thanks a lot for joining us tonight. We really appreciated it and enjoyed it. For those of you who are watching who are UT FedSoc chapter members, I'm going to really quickly plug our debate watch party next Tuesday. If you're interested in joining that, please reach out to Henry Humphreys to get the details on our socially distanced and online options for the debate watch party. But Mr. Carney, thanks a lot for joining us tonight, and we appreciate it.
Have a good one. Thank you.
Take care.